Thank you, men. Thank you, choir. Thank you, choir. In Galatians, we read, "But when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, an heir through God." There is an episode of a popular sitcom that largely has to do with a woman's due date. I'll spare you most of the details, which are largely immaterial. Suffice it to say that this particular character was a working woman who never expected to give birth. Her life and her schedule depended largely and mostly on her keeping a schedule and meeting the needs of many clients. She was absolutely and totally driven by her work. As a result, and with the help of her due date, she decided that the only thing to do, given the situation, was to schedule her C-section. By scheduling, I mean she did this several weeks ahead of time, a date that would best coincide with her very busy work schedule. She was so confident of this date that she managed to drag all of her friends into the scheme. She printed and mailed invitations to her C-section party. Her friends would be with her at the hospital prior to her surgery. And then, after the birth, while she and the baby were cleaned up and prepped, her friends would go out for dinner, and then they would return to the hospital where there would be the grand unveiling of her new daughter. The plan was perfect. She had this thing mapped out to the final moment and detail. Only, and you may have guessed this by now, she went into labor some days before the due date. There she was at the hospital, still busy trying to deal with all her clients while in labor. But worst, none of her friends was able to be there with her at 0 hour. They, of course, had their own responsibilities and obligations, and they could not reschedule. So the child arrived, minus nearly all the cast of characters she had planned who were supposed to be present, and the baby came at the appointed time. Not her appointed time, but the appointed time. The appointed time. Babies do come at the appointed time. Now, it is true, our children and their mommies are given assigned times, which we call due dates. But as anyone knows who has been around or through the process, that's a best guess. Babies will arrive when babies will arrive, complete with their own looks and personalities. They arrive in an aura of mystery and wonder. Even Jesus arrived this way. Maybe we should say especially Jesus arrived this way. Now, I do need to add a caveat this morning. I know we're going to be telling the stories of Advent and Christmas in the coming weeks. We haven't even yet arrived at Advent, today the Sunday being the Sunday before Thanksgiving. Today is the time for Now Thank We All Our God, and we gather together. And you've heard some of the great music of the season already this morning, which is as it should be. Moreover, those of you who are inclined to watch the church calendar know that this is Christ the King Sunday. This is the culminating service of a whole year of events and worship that began last year on the first Sunday of Advent. The calendar, you see, begins with that expectancy around December 1st and travels through the birth and recognition of Jesus' death and resurrection and moves through his life and ministry, and then climaxes on this day when we celebrate that, among other things, Christ is King. So it might seem we are jumping the gun with this particular passage and story, but if we are, it is because today was the day we could dedicate 4 young lives to the Lord. It would have been wrong for us not to do this today. These children came at the appointed time, they were born at the appointed time, and they were dedicated at the appointed time. They arrived in their own auras of wonder and mystery, and today we celebrate in another aura of wonder and mystery. It's kind of like this. There was a plan for these children all along. We just didn't know it all. This is part of the wonder of the Christian life, that God calls the shots. The Apostle Paul was wise enough, with the guiding hand of the Spirit, to say it in words like this: God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to buy freedom for those who were under the law, in order that we might attain the status of sons. Paul was talking about birth, about Christmas, but he was talking about so much more. I'm more than a little sad when we do not connect Christmas with the rest of Jesus' life. I'm well aware of that there are those of us who revel in babies, and these get a little sad when the infants start crawling, because all of a sudden they're beginning to assert their independence. And even more so when they begin to walk, and even more when they begin to climb. It all goes to a new level when they find their own language, and they do find their own language. Many love babies. Now, you can't control or manipulate a toddler like you can an infant. And you can't manipulate or control a toddler or a 3-year-old like you can a toddler. With each passing year, the child demonstrates more independence and personality. They become maybe even more interesting and loving, but they move past our capacity to be able to get them to do what we want them to do. So I ask you, those of you who love babies most of all, what if they always remained babies? And to those of us who love the Christ child of the manger most of all, what if Jesus never grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man? You do know what we would be missing, don't you? We are celebrating beginnings this morning, but we ought not to think that the appointed time has to do only with a birth date, or even in this case, with a dedication. There are more appointed times ahead for these children. Is that not what we began to pray when we asked God to bring them to their own commitments to Christ, at which point they would also sit down at the Lord's Supper table with us? So we look at what Paul has to say. He begins by saying, Jesus was born of a woman. I think that should have special meaning for us. Jesus was fully God and fully human, and the fully human part of that means he was born of a woman. He entered this world humbly. You might say that God arranged it in such a way that God underscored the humble part of his birth. His parents were refugees of a sort at the time of his birth. The word refugee seems to have a special meaning for us right now. You might say, but Mary and Joseph were returning to an ancestral home for a census. And so they were. But they were on the road with a streaming body of humanity. And when they got where they were going, Bethlehem, there was no one to greet them. They had no one to take them in. Have pity on this poor family. This woman is 9 months pregnant. Is there no one who would convert even a tiny space into a labor and birthing suite? No, apparently not. So some animals gained a new friend one night. That's what I mean by God's underscoring the humble part of Jesus' birth. That's what Paul meant by those very important words, born of a woman. You might say we have 4 living, breathing object lessons of Christmas before us here today. Born of their mothers, born crying into this world, coming into this world in an aura of wonder and mystery, born of a woman just like Jesus, and born under the law. Paul tells us Jesus was born under the law. Literally, he was born under a law that brought Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem. A decree was given by the Emperor Caesar Augustus throughout the Roman world that a census should be made. Quirinius was governor of Syria at the time, everyone had to go to his own hometown for registration. Everyone then now is under some kind of law, written or not. In the hospital, parents, all right, what name are you going to give your child? Do you want that boy circumcised? Here's some more paperwork. You can't get out of here without some paperwork. Oh, it'll take a while for the birth certificates to be processed. In our particular part of the world, most are born under these laws and demands. As Jesus grew up, though, law came to mean something else for him. You see, law has a spiritual restraint on people. Our children learn something about rules and regulations and laws early in life. Much of it comes through the effective use of the word no, and that's with an exclamation point. That no provides moments when rules get imprinted on minds. In my thinking, I shall always remember an incident in front of the Louisiana, Missouri Walmart where Drew attempted to dart into traffic and a strong no and restraint physically prevented his getting into traffic. Every one of you could tell a similar story. Here's the thing. As we employ the law, generally the law prevents our doing something. It does not help us achieve something. Spiritually, no one gets saved by obeying the law. None of us is that good. So Jesus, born under the law, came to buy freedom for those who were under the law in order that they might attain the status of children. He came to buy freedom for us. Jesus grew into a man, again, fully God, fully man, who understood what the law meant. He understood what the law was unable to do and what, according to the Father's leading, he was supposed to do. You see, there were appointed times in Jesus' life. At the appointed time, Jesus, 12 years old, entered the temple. When Mary and Joseph found him days later, he told them, "Did you not know that I needed to be about my Father's business?" At the appointed time, Jesus, much to the chagrin of his cousin John, asked John to baptize him in the river Jordan. John complied, and the Lord spoke a blessing over Jesus. And it happened at the appointed time. At the appointed time, Jesus asked his disciples who others said that he was. And then he asked them who they thought he was. Peter responded, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." At the appointed time, the truth was spoken. At the appointed time, Jesus took his inner circle of disciples to the Mount. We know it as the Mount of Transfiguration, for there not only was Jesus transformed, but he was in the presence of Moses and Elijah. And it happened at the appointed time. At the appointed time, it was Passover, really. Jesus sat down with his disciples at table. At the appointed time, he went to the garden to pray, and then he was arrested by the Roman soldiers, and then he was tried and convicted, and then he was placed on a Roman cross. Then he died and was buried, and after the greatest pause in human history, he was raised from the dead. All of it. Every piece of it at the appointed time. So don't ever think that what we do here is coincidental. Do not think it is coincidental. It is not. We assume responsibilities. We are called to act in obedience, but it's about timing, and it's about God's appointed time. God knows the appointed time. So here's where all this leads. God sent his Son that we might receive adoption to sonship. Because if you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts. So you are no longer slaves, but God's children. And since you are children, he has made you his heirs. God's work is timing. The effect is adoption, redemption, salvation. None of which would happen if we still had Jesus only in the manger. One of the beautiful parts of today's service is that we are beginning to anticipate what will happen in those 4 young lives. Next Sunday, we officially open the season of Advent, but as far as these children are concerned, the season of expectation has already begun. We pray for their young lives, and we await God's movement within them. Which leaves us with a question. You see, one day we will turn around and look at the twists and turns of our own lives, or if we are already old enough, as some of us are, we will have begun already doing that examining. You will see in a way how God has moved and touched lives and inserted himself. You see how the whole thing fits together. Oh, so that's what that moment meant, or that's why I was there. The mystery of the entire thing becomes the joyful fulfillment of life. We assess those appointed times. Did we meet God at the appointed time? I only cut class once in seminary, and I always prepared for tests. But there is one night that sticks out in my mind. I was a student at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City. With my friends Nolan and Wendy, I had recently graduated from Southwest Baptist College in Bolivar. As students there, we had followed the men's basketball team very closely, very intently. And now, even though we were almost 3 hours away from campus, we were still following it. What made the situation intriguing on this particular occasion, though, was that the team was having a very good year. They were facing a pivotal opponent at home on Thursday night, and we were 145 miles away. Had we still been in Bolivar, we would have been at the game, but now, here we are on a school night wishing we were there. I don't know who suggested that we go to that game. It would mean leaving right after the afternoon class and then returning home very late. There was the financial consideration, too. We were poor seminarians. We didn't have a lot of expendable cash. There was the time consideration. Thursday night was going to be a short night, but then there was the Old Testament test consideration. How would I study for Pierce Matheny's Old Testament class if I were on the road and watching basketball? That was the piece of the puzzle that concerned me most. Was I going to be ready for that test? I told Nolan and Wendy I didn't think I could go. What about this test? And that's when Nolan spoke words that have echoed in my skull for 42 years. Phillips, what are you going to remember, the night you studied for another test or the night you went to the basketball game? I went to the basketball game. I don't know if it was an appointed time, though it felt like it. But here's the question. When you have walked further down this road we call life and assess where Jesus may have met you, will you be able to say, I met him at the appointed time? And is it possible that that time is now? Our hymn of invitation is number 411. God always invites us to come as we are. May we do so in response to him as we stand together and sing.